Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Indie Pop Girl, the podcast for music chat, new releases, hidden gems, and nostalgic deep dives. I am back with the introduction to my brand new series, Underrated Gems. I'll be talking about the records that I love that just don't get enough attention. These are the albums that you need to hear, and I'm kicking off the series with Lost Girls from Bat for Lashes. And before we get into the episode, if you enjoy music deep dives like this, please consider following the podcast or leaving a like depending on where you're listening. It really helps the show reach more people, and it means a lot for a small independent podcast like this one. Lost Girls is the fifth studio album by English singer-songwriter and multi-instrumentalist Natasha Khan, also known professionally as Bat for Lashes. It was released on the 6th of September 2019 through AWAL. It is the follow-up to Natasha's Mercury Prize nominated album The Bride, released in 2016. Natasha handled the majority of the production duties alongside Charles Scott and Jennifer De Silvio. There is also additional production from MNEK. Natasha has pulled inspiration from the music and cinema of the 1980s, and that is evident when you listen to the record. It's atmospheric and cinematic with a full, lush production. Lost Girls was slightly ahead of the curve with the 80s trend which dominated the 2020s with artists such as The Weeknd, Doja Cat and Dua Lipa. Yes, the 80s style is there with the synths, but what is remarkable is that Natasha and her collaborators have made the record sound fresh and contemporary. But it also sounds like it is lifted from the charts back in 1984. After moving to Los Angeles in 2017 to focus on screenwriting and composing film scores, Natasha began to develop and write a script. Inspired by 80s films such as E.T., The Goonies, and the more obvious choice, The Lost Boys, Natasha envisioned a sci-fi horror film titled The Lost Girls. The story follows an alter ego named Nikki who encounters a mystical gang of female vampire bikers in the California desert. Eventually, the script developed into Natasha's next record, and the film was shelved. The visuals were expanded in the music videos for the album singles, and Natasha has confirmed that she hopes to finish and produce her film project in the future. I am so glad that Natasha ended up creating a new record because Lost Girls is one of those albums that is essential listening. If you grew up in the 1980s like I did and love synth pop, you really can't get any better than Lost Girls. This passed me by upon release as towards the end of 2019 I was knee-deep in preparing for my wedding. I am a big fan of Bat for Lashes and always enjoyed her music. I am so nostalgic for her Fur and Gold record and of course her most well-known song, Daniel. This was a record that I eventually caught up on during the pandemic. I remember reading articles and reviews about Lost Girls and its concept, and it was sold to me right away. Reading about Natasha citing the Blue Nile as one of the inspirations immediately pulled me in. Natasha is one of my favourite vocalists. There is something so soothing about her warm tone, and it's perfectly matched here with a synth pop production. She has also got a relaxing speaking voice, and she uses this to her advantage in Lost Girls as well. I sometimes go on YouTube and watch her interviews so I can hear her speak. It's so soothing. Lost Girls is one of my favourite pop albums ever. It's immaculate in its execution, and Natasha fully understood the assignment to deliver an addictive, cohesive record full of pop hooks, catchy melodies, sparkling synths, drum machines, and Natasha's beautiful voice cutting through the glossy production. It's a record that had critical acclaim upon release, but one that has gone completely under the radar. It is the inspiration for my new series, Underrated Gems. And if you have not heard this record before and are new to Bat for Lashes, then I hope you do check out Natasha's work, and especially this record. I hope to bring you some records as part of this series, which you might not have heard of before, but all the records that I have chosen are ones that I love and are constantly in rotation on streaming and vinyl. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, I will not be playing clips of the songs, so if you are curious, then please support the artists I cover by streaming, downloading, or buying physical copies. Thank you. Track 1, Kids in the Dark. The press release for Lost Girls actually sums up the whole record perfectly, and this track in particular, with a description of it's an album for driving in the dark, holding hands at sunset, jumping off bridges with vampires, riding your bike across the moon. That vivid imagery, drenched in 1980s nostalgia, runs right through this record. Kids in the Dark opens the album with that beautiful synth arpeggio that slowly fades in, already creating a sense of atmosphere before the song has even properly begun. When the track fully comes in, it's just so rich with those shimmering synths. It gives me strong Take My Breath Away vibes, mixed in with a bit of Pat Benatar energy thrown in as well. Natasha clearly understands the magic of the 80s, taking inspiration not only from the music of that decade, but also from the iconic films that defined it. But even with all those nostalgic influences, there's something about this track that still sounds completely fresh and contemporary. Kids in the Dark is genuinely one of my favourite songs of all time, and honestly, I think it's one of the best pop songs ever written. I still can't quite believe that a track this perfect managed to fly under the radar. Natasha deserved a huge hit with this. It's absolutely captivating. Her smooth, warm voice sits perfectly against the lush synth production, and everything about it just feels so effortless. The song captures that feeling of falling in love under peach coloured sunsets, with the hot LA air hanging in the background, the desert and the mountains stretching out around you. You can almost see the glowing neon lights on a late night drive, like the track belongs in a classic 80s film montage. The production and synth work are truly out of this world. If you're unfamiliar with this track, I really do hope you check it out after listening to this episode, because it deserves so much more love. The music video, directed by Natasha herself, brings all of those visuals and that dreamy imagery to life. It's absolutely stunning. Track 2, The Hunger. So, like Natasha, I'm also an 80s child. I grew up listening to synth pop and watching films that I probably wasn't supposed to be watching. It feels like the nostalgia for that decade is stronger than ever at the moment. The 80s aesthetic is everywhere on social media, and even artists from that era are having a resurgence. Madonna, for example, is having a real moment again with her 1986 track Live to Tell, suddenly finding a whole new audience on TikTok. There really was something magical about that time. So much incredible music was coming out, and cinema was producing these unforgettable cult classics that people still talk about today. When I first discovered this album, and this track in particular, the title immediately made me think of the cult 1983 film The Hunger, directed by Tony Scott. The film was a loose adaptation of the 1981 novel written by Whitley Strieber, and it tells the story of a strange love triangle between a doctor, played by David Bowie, and a vampire couple portrayed by Susan Sarandon and Catherine Deneuve. Now, I'm not entirely sure whether Natasha actually pulled inspiration from that film for this track. She has spoken a lot about her love for The Lost Boys, another iconic cult 80s vampire movie, and that influence definitely runs through the whole Lost Girls aesthetic. But for the longest time, I was convinced the song must have been inspired by The Hunger. It's funny because once I went back and read more interviews about the album around in 2020, the Lost Boys connection suddenly seemed obvious, but I'd been thinking about The Hunger for so long that it just stuck in my head. Musically, this track is really all about the build up to that incredibly satisfying bridge. When it finally arrives with that huge wall of synths and production, it's just one of those moments where you think, wow, holy shit. Natasha's vocals almost feel like a call and response in that section, and it works beautifully. There's so much going on in the instrumental as well. Layer upon layer of synths build this rich, lush wall of sound that feels completely immersive. The way that particular synth line comes in during the bridge always reminds me of the atmosphere of the theme from the Terminator. It doesn't sound exactly the same, but the mood instantly takes me back to 1984. That theme, written by Brad Fiedel, is one of the most iconic synth pieces of music ever created. And listening to The Hunger really reminds me of how powerful and cinematic music can be. It's probably why so many modern artists still look back to the 80s for inspiration, because honestly, it really was an incredible decade for music. Track 3, Feel for You. We're staying in 1984 for this track. The title immediately made me think of I Feel for You, originally written by Prince, which became a massive worldwide hit for Shaka Khan in that same year. Feel for You is almost like a dreamy instrumental moment on the album, with just a few sparse lyrics woven into the music. But honestly, it doesn't need anything more than that. Natasha lets the instrumental do most of the talking here, and she balances the upbeat production perfectly to keep the listener completely engaged. Natasha actually explained in an interview that the song is essentially about that feeling of being in love and just enjoying the moment. I'm in love and it feels great, and we're just driving around LA and it's beautiful. And you really do feel that when you listen to it. The track feels loose, carefree, and joyful, like one of those warm nights where you're just driving around with nowhere in particular to go. Once again, the production and mixing are incredibly impressive. And what I love about Lost Girls is how Natasha embraces the influence of the 1980s, the music, the films, and the aesthetic, but she still manages to make everything sound fresh and contemporary. Nothing on this record feels tired or dated. It doesn't feel like a copy of the past, it feels like its own world. Listening to Lost Girls in preparation for this episode made me think of Girl with No Face by Ali X, another synth pop record that I absolutely love. Both albums channel that dark, atmospheric 80s energy while still sounding modern and distinctive. They're clearly inspired by classic synth pop production, but they're driven by some really strong songwriting and thoughtful production choices. And I know I keep saying it, but the synth work on Lost Girls really is outstanding. I also don't think Natasha gets enough credit for just how many roles she plays in creating this music. She's not only the songwriter and vocalist, but also a multi instrumentalist, producer, and engineer. On this record, she's absolutely bringing her A game, and her talent deserves far more recognition. Track 4, Desert Man. Desert Man shifts the mood slightly into something darker and more haunting. The track is driven by those electronic programmed drums, layered with gorgeous synth textures and plenty of reverb that really adds to the atmosphere. It has this spacious cinematic quality that fits perfectly with the world Natasha is creating throughout Lost Girls. One line that really stands out to me appears in the second verse. Measuring the vastness of pastel blue, measuring the sadness I see in you. It's such a poetic image. You could read it as a metaphor for a lover struggling with depression, or perhaps even a reflection on life in Los Angeles itself. A place that looks glamorous and beautiful on the surface, but where there can be something darker or more complicated underneath. Natasha expresses that contrast so delicately and beautifully. The song itself feels lush and atmospheric, exploring themes of longing and emotional distance. Natasha's vocal performance really becomes the core element of the track. When the chorus arrives, her voice lifts the song in a really powerful way, which contrasts with the more introspective verses that hint at a complicated relationship. The synths throughout the track are wonderfully dreamy, giving the whole piece that rich, immersive atmosphere that runs through the album. There's also a stripped back piano version of Desert Man, which reveals another side of the song entirely. I always appreciate when artists do this because it allows you to hear the songwriting in a completely different light. When you remove the production and just focus on the melody and lyrics, it can give you a whole new perspective. Ali X did something similar with Galena from Girl with No Face, and I get a very similar feeling here. It's the same song, but it suddenly feels more intimate and emotionally exposed. Track 5, Jasmine. This is one of my favourites on the entire record. The production here is just on another level. That synth line is so fucking addictive. Honestly, I could listen to that melody on repeat and still want more. It's one of those hooks that immediately pulls you into the song. I also absolutely love it when Natasha uses a spoken word approach in her music. She's done this before, most famously on What's a Girl to Do from Fur and Gold, and it works just as beautifully here. The spoken delivery in the verses feels incredibly satisfying. Then, when Natasha moves into that higher vocal range in the chorus, it creates this gorgeous contrast. You can really hear the attention to detail throughout the track. There's clearly so much love and care poured into this album, and it feels obvious that Lost Girls was a real labour of love for Natasha, especially in the way she embraces the aesthetics and storytelling of the 1980s. Part of what makes the album stand out is the narrative element running through it. The story of the protagonist Nikki Pink and the mysterious group known as the Lost Girls gives the whole record this cinematic quality, almost like you're listening to a soundtrack to an imaginary film. I know I've been making a few comparisons to Ali X, but there's another small detail that caught my attention in the lyrics of Jasmine. In the opening line of the first verse, Natasha says, she drives hard through the June gloom haze. Interestingly, Ali X later released a track called June Gloom on her album Cape God from 2020. At first, I assumed June gloom might be referring to a kind of summer melancholy, but it actually describes a real weather phenomenon in Los Angeles where the sky stays overcast and foggy during the early summer months. That hazy atmosphere can linger for days, which fits beautifully with the dreamy, slightly mysterious world Natasha is creating here. Another lyric that really stands out to me is a body bag on eucalyptus hills. It's such vivid cinematic imagery. The song itself is centered around the character Jasmine, who seems to lure men in before killing them and burying their bodies near the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. Even the name Jasmine feels symbolic. The flower has a powerful, intoxicating scent, something sweet and alluring that draws people in. That could easily be a metaphor for the way this vampire character seduces her victims. I love the contrast between the softness of Jasmine and the sharp, potent, almost medicinal smell of eucalyptus. It's such beautiful visual writing from Natasha. Track 6, Vampires. Next, we have Vampires, which is a full instrumental. And I have to say, the placement of this track in the album is absolutely perfect. After the previous songs, this moment feels like a pause in the story, but not a calm one. Vampires is dark, brooding, and moody, completely drenched in this gothic style of production. The only way I can really describe it is like this. Imagine a film montage. It's pouring with rain. Everything feels shadowy and atmospheric, and you're somewhere deep in the middle of the story. Musically, it feels like a blend of several iconic 80s sounds. There's that moody guitar and bass that reminds me of The Cure, layered with reverb-heavy electronic drums. Then you have those dramatic synth textures that feel very Depeche Mode, before suddenly a saxophone solo appears that honestly wouldn't feel out of place on Songs from the Big Chair by Tears for Fears. I know that description probably sounds like a bit of a hot mess, but trust me, it works beautifully. It's one of those moments on the album that really leans into the cinematic world Natasha has created. Even without lyrics, you can picture the story continuing to unfold. It feels mysterious, slightly dangerous, and perfectly in keeping with the whole vampire inspired atmosphere running through the record. Track 7, So Good. So Good is really the album's pure 80s pop moment. You could easily imagine someone like Taylor Dane or Martika belting this out on stage, surrounded by dry ice and leather jackets. And by the way, if you don't know who those artists are, just go on YouTube and check them out. Hopefully, you'll know what I mean. I love that Natasha completely commits to this pop moment and she executes it with so much class and attention to detail. But don't let the sunny, sparkly production fool you because the lyrics here are pretty toxic as fuck. It's very clear that Natasha is describing a complicated and unhealthy relationship. She's deeply drawn to this person, but at the same time, she recognizes the emotional damage it's causing. One line that really stands out is, "One look at him and I can feel the pain." She knows this person isn't good for her, but she can't seem to break away from it. And in the second verse, she sings, "It's an addiction that I cannot fight." Well, that line really sums up the whole dynamic of the song. There's also a sense that she's aware of the cycle she's stuck in. She even admits, "And I'm the only one to blame," which suggests she's not necessarily blaming the other person for the toxicity, but recognizing her own role in staying in the relationship. It becomes this loop that keeps repeating itself. There's a line that really captures that feeling, the drug that never numbs the pain. It hints that the attraction, whether emotional, physical, or both, is simply too powerful to walk away from. What's fascinating is how all of that darkness is wrapped up inside such an upbeat and catchy track. That contrast is actually very difficult to pull off, but Natasha does it brilliantly. The song sounds bright, glossy, and energetic on the surface, while the story underneath is far more complicated. Personally, I'm always a sucker for that kind of contrast. Dark, melancholy themes disguised beneath synths and electronic pop production. It wins my heart every time. Track 8, Safe Tonight. I just love the intro into this track with Natasha's vocals completely drenched in reverb. It immediately gives the song this dreamy, hazy feeling before it slowly opens up with that beautiful electronica and bass line. There's also a real sense of vulnerability running through this track, which I really like. The line, "So in love, you'd leave me behind," captures this quiet insecurity within a relationship. That fear of loving someone deeply might not necessarily mean they'll stay. It adds another emotional layer to the album because up to this point we've had the cinematic storytelling, the darker themes, and the big synth moments. But here Natasha lets a more fragile side come through. I also really love the 80s style guitar that runs throughout the track. It reminds me a little of Phil Collins around the No Jacket Required era, that clean, atmospheric guitar tone that sits beautifully within the production. One thing I really appreciate about Lost Girls is just how detailed the arrangements are. These songs sound fantastic on vinyl, where the synths and production really shine. But you can also pick out so many little elements when you listen on a good pair of headphones. It's one of those albums where the more closely you listen, the more small details you start to notice. Track 9, Peach Sky. Peach Sky is driven by some really striking percussion. The beats are quite sharp and harsh compared to the rest of the album, but as a switch up, it works really well. I read that Natasha incorporated Middle Eastern inspired rhythms and percussion into this track, and it actually fits the title perfectly. There's something about the rhythm and atmosphere that feels expansive and slightly mysterious. Compared to the rest of the record, this song definitely feels more experimental. On paper, you might think those heavier percussion elements wouldn't blend with the synth and electronic textures, but somehow Natasha makes it work. In a way, it reminds me of how Tears for Fears would mix electronic production with live drums and bold percussion, creating something that felt powerful but still atmospheric and full and lush. One moment that really stands out is the use of the reverse vocals. It's unexpected but incredibly effective. When I first heard it, it immediately made me think of David Lynch and those surreal Red Room scenes in Twin Peaks. Natasha has often cited David Lynch as one of her biggest creative inspirations, and this moment feels like a subtle nod to his work. Hearing something so strange and dreamlike appear in the middle of this shimmering soundscape is such a clever touch. And honestly, anyone who references the late great David Lynch will always have my respect. As a penultimate track on the album, you can also start to feel that sense that the story is coming to an end. There's a quiet feeling of longing and reflection here that echoes some of the themes we had heard earlier in the record. Those sparkling synths that close the track are beautiful. They really do evoke the image of a peach coloured sky at sunset, the day fading out, the night about to begin. I always love it when production choices create that kind of visual imagery. Track 10, Mountains. This is probably my favourite vocal performance from Natasha on the entire record. There's so much longing and emotion in the way she delivers the song. She moves between different vocal tones so effortlessly, and it really gives the track a real sense of depth. There's also a moment that feels like it loops right back to the beginning of the album, when she sings, "Can we make it right, like it was at the start? Sing to me in the dark." It almost echoes the world we were introduced to in Kids in the Dark. It creates this beautiful full circle feeling, like the story is returning to where it began. Her warm vocal tone, surrounded by that soft reverb, just sounds gorgeous. I also love the background vocals that appear after the first chorus. They almost sound like a choral sample, and they give me strong orchestral manoeuvres in the dark vibes. If you're familiar with OMD, you'll probably recognise the kind of sound I'm talking about. It's a technique they use quite often, and it fits perfectly with the album's 80s inspired aesthetic. Another detail I've really come to appreciate is the use of piano in this track. I never really noticed it properly before, but while preparing for this episode, I've been listening to the album a lot on headphones. It's been lovely discovering little elements in the production that I hadn't picked up on before. As the closing track, Mountains really feels like the perfect ending. It has that classic final song energy, almost like the music playing over the end credits of a film. It's lush, grand, and triumphant, but there's also a gentle sense of hope as the song draws to a close. I especially love how Natasha lets the outro gradually fade away, giving us those warm, sparkling synths one last time. It feels like the sun is finally setting on the world of Lost Girls, quietly bringing the whole story to an end. As we reach the end of Lost Girls, I think it's important to mention just how well this record was received when it was released. Critics really embraced the album, praising Natasha Khan for the world she created and the way she blended cinematic storytelling with rich synth pop production. Many reviews highlighted how cohesive the album feels, almost like a soundtrack to a film that doesn't exist. And yet, despite that critical acclaim, Lost Girls somehow slipped under the radar. What's interesting is that around the same time, the 80s revival in pop music was becoming huge. Albums like After Hours by The Weeknd, Future Nostalgia by Dua Lipa, and even Hot Pink by Doja Cat were bringing that glossy, neon, 80s inspired sound back into the mainstream. Tracks like Say So, Don't Start Now, and of course, Blinding Lights became massive global hits, and suddenly that whole synth driven aesthetic was everywhere again. And yet, Lost Girls had already captured that atmosphere so perfectly in 2019. Natasha didn't just borrow from the decade stylistically, she built an entire world around it. The storytelling, the imagery, the characters, and the production all come together to create something that feels completely immersive and unique. It's honestly a shame that this album was forgotten about so quickly, because it's such a beautifully executed record. Every detail feels thoughtful and intentional, from the synth work and production to the emotional storytelling running through the songs. In many ways, Lost Girls is actually the inspiration behind this new Underrated Gems series. It's exactly the kind of album I want to celebrate. Records that were critically admired, but perhaps didn't reach the wider audience they deserved. Albums that quietly slip through the cracks, but still hold so much beauty and creativity. And if you've never heard Lost Girls before, I really hope this episode encouraged you to go and spend some time with it. It's one of those albums that rewards you the more you listen. The atmosphere, the storytelling, the production, all slowly revealing themselves. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. If you've enjoyed it, I'd really appreciate it if you could follow, like, or share, as it helps other music lovers discover my podcast. If you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like this episode and subscribe to the Indie Pop Girl podcast. It really helps the algorithm push the video out to more people. And as a small independent podcast that's still growing, every like and subscription genuinely makes a huge difference. I'm posting full episodes, shorts, and little teasers over there, so there's always something new to watch. Let me know in the comments if you love Bat for Lashes and if Lost Girls is your favourite album from Natasha. I always read and respond to comments, and I love hearing what you all think. You can find me on Instagram and Threads at the Indie Pop Girl, and on TikTok at the Indie Pop Girl podcast. And if you want to dive even deeper, there's a public Spotify playlist called favourite tracks from podcast episodes, where I add some of my top picks from each record I cover. It's updated as new episodes drop, so you might just find your next obsession. I'll be back very soon for another instalment in the Underrated Gems series. For the next episode, I'll be discussing an indie pop record from a cult artist that is full of dreamy dream pop with a touch of shoegaze. Until then, I'm Rachel, the Indie Pop Girl. Thanks for listening, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.